I think an outline of my response is going to be distributed in a second.
Okay. Oh yes. Should I introduce you, Harald?
Let me also
fill up the time for
I could fill the time with thanking you for having me here, because vorrei anche ringraziare la Fondazione Luisa Sanoncelli per la generosità di ospitarci, e vorrei anche non dimenticare Ilaria Campanella per tutta la gentilezza e le sforzi che ha fatto per noi. I'm a bit embarrassed. To sit here on the podium because, as you know, I'm a foreigner to your field, and I'm very eager to learn from you. It's a great privilege, and it's definitely one of the luckiest events of my chances of my life that I've ended up in Regensburg and have the chance to learn from David Hiley. But I'm very reluctant to speak up in your distinguished presence, because I have learned tremendously from all the papers and from the tools I was asked to respond to in particular, and all I can offer is some questions which articulate where particularly I personally and I have to learn more, and I think my discipline should learn more from you. So I'm very grateful for this chance, because I want to start with a very brief introductory apology that it's partly my personal ignorance, but it's also a blatant research deficit of liturgical studies, which have not really yet paid attention to the Historiae. There is a great neglect of the Sanctorale in general in liturgical studies, which has to do with the quantitative and qualitative occupation of liturgical scholars of the last two generations with reform of what they thought should be important in contemporary liturgy, and that was not the Sanctorale. And in the written paper I have some footnotes just to demonstrate how great the degree of neglect of this important genre is in my field. And I want to structure my very brief response in a brief introductory remark, two little sets of questions and observations to the two papers, and one little concluding synthetic part of trying to bind these questions together. So the preliminary remark is that it's a truism that sanctoral feasts start as local observations. Saints' feasts are originally, by definition, extraordinary events of paramount importance for a given community. It's a local phenomenon. Typically, saints are, as you all know, in their origins, celebrated at the anniversary of the death of the given saint, and at the very tomb. And the Roman calendar is very much a stational calendar, with the congregation going to the various saints' tombs during the course of the year. Of course, already in the earliest calendars which we have, there is a certain exchange of saints, but it's still a significant exchange between given local communities which feast saints of great local importance in a stational system, which meant much to the persons involved, because it was rooted in the topography and not only in the calendar of a typically urban congregation, especially, of course, in the case of Rome and other metropolises of late antiquity. And when this system gets exported or adopted by other churches, what is a feast at a given place of great importance to the congregation becomes a formula in liturgy and a mere date in the calendar. And that's basically what happened to the Roman stratum of the Saints' Feast. And as Susan Rankin yesterday has demonstrated, that this is a stable core. Of course, we all know that, and the Historia are the place of paramount importance where locally important feasts enter and remain important, and that's important to recognize for liturgists, because they tend to ignore that. They focus on the Roman stratum and tend to neglect the offices of less impact. So hierarchies begin to distinguish Festa Fori from Festa Chori, and the offices, in fact, obviously pertain to the Festa Fori, to the really important feasts, which are not just a different office in choir. But the question arises, of course, how great is the actual import beyond the choir? That's a question liturgists have only recently adopted, to step beyond the textual boundaries of a given office. So the question is, who profited from the offices? Just monks and clerics? How was the relation of the office to the obvious importance of the feasts of saints who had the chance of being honored with such an elaborate festal office? And are there sources and methods to assess this actual reception? Which brings me to more particular to the challenges of Henry Parkes's paper, the quest for the ritual experience. Liturgical history aims at reconstructing, in a sense, the historical ritual experience, and there two complementary questions arise. One, not least the Annal school of historiography has taught us to pay attention to the actual import of the common in common reception, the reception beyond the norm, the meaning beyond the book, if you will, and the experience of the people actually involved. That's a critical question. The positive question is, how do we reconstruct the experience of the intended competent subjects of the celebration? And that's what Henry has showed us, and that's in a sense the primary object of liturgical studies: the intended competent subject, not the persons just happening to be present, but those who perform the given office in an attentive and understanding way, and who are able to recognize allusions, musical codes, and intertextual references. There's some methodological elements in that. The examples of teleology, which are reinforced by when they contrast to the norm, and I found Henry's observation that responsories have ascending orders, particularly important because the rule, as you say, with antiphons is descending orders. That goes back to the rule of St. Benedict. So when we have ascending roles, that's all the more significant. I would have a question to the role of the abbot in the gospel, because that's not necessarily the end of an ascending hierarchy, but that the abbot reads the gospel ultimately goes back to late antique Jerusalem, where the abbot where the bishop reads the gospel on Sunday vigil, and there he represents Christ or the angel of in the resurrection narrative. So that's a mimetic reasoning, and not just the end, the end of the ladder of the hierarchy. But of course, that may be secondarily integrated in the ritual experience. And as you all know, that in the biblical texts employed in the Roman core of the office, horizons are important, because texts are employed in different situations of the liturgical year, and the meaning, and I think that's the particularly Roman liturgical experience, that one given biblical text, because the Roman liturgy is so biblicist, is enriched by the resonances it has when a text is employed in Advent and in the Easter cycle and for that matter in the Sanctorale. So it's constitutive to have in mind what is not said in a given liturgical situation. That's evident in many places. Think on the first Sunday of Advent, where the antiphons to Lauds quote Zechariah, the Gospel, quoted in the Gospel of the day. So that's that play with Epistle and Gospel, but not the part which is quoted in the Gospel of the day. So you have to have the context in mind to have the experience which is intended by the office for its competent use, as it were. Or there are many instances where you know the intention of the context is contrasted by changing significantly the biblical quotations. So my question would be how Historiae fit into and add to this cosmos of intertextual relations, biblical and non-biblical. And that brings me to the role of the obviously non-biblical texts of the Historiae, that from the outset, the Sanctorale, the saint celebrations, is the place in liturgy where non-biblical texts are used as if they were canonical texts. If you have a theory of canonicity, what's a canonical text? A canonical text is a text which is constitutive for a given community, which is sanctioned by repetition, annual repetition in this case, and therefore the text itself is capable of being alluded to and not only quoted, which makes its beauty and its particular appeal. So my question would also be, is there, in the case of Historiae, which obviously is more than just a narrated and staged and sung excerpt of a vita, what are the particular hermeneutical requirements for a competent use of this office? In which categories is this to be described and analyzed? Which has already brought me to the intertextual question of Benjamin's paper and the question for the role of the Psalms. When Psalms are used in liturgy, they are at festive occasions rarely used in their plain sense, but there are hermeneutical shifts which makes biblical scholars angry about what liturgy does with biblical texts. And there are formal techniques, the isolation of snippets and their recontextualization in other contexts where they shed light on the festive occasion. So psalms are put into the mouth of Christ, or in our case, into the mouth of saints, or if they are in third person, they are quotations about what about that given person, about Christ, about the saint, telling something biblical being fulfilled in the given person's life. These procedures are already employed in the New Testament when psalms are put into the mouth of Christ. In the Passion, it's obvious, and there are many other cases. And this is liturgically employed not only in the Roman tradition, but as early as we have lectionary and therefore use of psalms in the Bible, in 5th century Jerusalem. And that happens especially with Christ, but also from Jerusalem on with saints, and particularly Saint Stephen. Whenever Stephen is involved, or Saint Stephen's church, Psalm 5 is quoted where it says, "You crowned him with glory," and to crown, of course, is Stephanor. So it plays with the Greek name of the saint. And the Sanctorale is definitely an area where these kinds of mechanisms are under investigated, under researched. Behind that is a hermeneutical procedure or hermeneutical questions of late antique commentary techniques, the so-called prosopological exegesis, the exegesis which asks for who is the prosopon, who is the role speaking in a given psalm. And they can be put into the mouth of Christ, can be assessed in some historical situation, applied to a saint. And by the way, that's also a pattern in rabbinic exegesis. They ask, to which situation does a given psalm apply? And then they say, well, that was the psalm said by Abraham in this and that situation. And that's not, of course, pretension of a historical situation, but playful exegesis. My question is this beautiful example of St. Stephen's office a remarkable exception, or is there more of this? And my particular question is that in the Romano-Frankish office of St. Stephen, there is an example, and up to my knowledge, a rare example of adapting a biblical quotation to the story of St. Stephen. The third antiphon of Lauds says, "Adhesit anima mea post te," my soul has clung to you, because quia caro mea lapidata, and that's a quotation from the Psalms, 62, the daily morning psalm. Quia caro mea lapidata est pro te, Deus meus. Caro mea, Deus meus, is a quotation from the psalm. My soul is searching for you, my God. But it says, because my flesh has been stoned for you, my God. So we have an example of this procedure already in what we can assume to be the Roman background of St. Stephen's office. So may that have triggered this procedure, or are there more examples of that? To conclude, Henry has beautifully drawn our attention to the performative aspects of these offices, and in his introduction labeled this as a progress of research, not only viewing of Historiae as a static piece of art, but as pieces to be performed. And I think that the performative aspect has another dimension, because the performance does something with those who perform it. And what is the performative aspect, the function of Historiae? Of course, it's the veneration of the saints, that's obvious. Monasteries dedicated to a local saint are literally believed in the Middle Ages, and there are plenty of quotations, to belong literally to the saint, and therefore paying veneration to the saint. The second is the plea for intercession at the climax, which by its position is the apex of the office. But is that all? What this office does with the participants? How does the celebration relate to the parts which are narrated in the past? How, in fact, liturgically speaking, is this anamnetic dimension constructed? And how does does this office transform those who perform? For the Psalmodic pieces, there's a beautifully established sound methodology in liturgical studies. You have this triangle of the lyrical ego of the psalms, the lyrical subject of the psalms, which is then transferred to a given person, to Christ or a saint, in the liturgical situation, but by being not only literally put into the mouth of the figure in question, but being performed by the mouth of the congregation, it merges the hermeneutical horizons of the biblical text, of the historical person, Christ, the saint, and of those performing the office, and therefore enables them to make congruent experiences. That's the intended experience of the competent subject of the liturgy. How do the Historiae fit in here, or change, or in this method, or which methods would we as liturgists have to learn to describe and analyze the liturgical meaning and, as far as performance, effect of Historiae? So these are my questions, very moderate.
Thank you very much indeed, Harald. I'd also hoped that a very senior scholar of liturgy, Arnold Angenent, might have been able to be present here. I knew that Harald would be here, but